So we talked last week in preparation for today's conversation and agreed that we wanted to talk about three things. So I'll share those things with you so that you sort of have a sense of where we're going. This film has been screened a lot, many times in many places, and so there's kind of a way in which it's being talked about. So I wanted us to do this as well here, so to see how do we here in Omaha together think about this film, but I also wanted to start the conversation by throwing in a different set of questions to kind of take us a little somewhere so we can go back to comfortable ground after. But first I'll introduce the two people who will be speaking with us tonight. I'm really excited. I met both Beth and Ash since I came here to Omaha last year. So it was really wonderful to see that there were so many people here that I wanted to have conversations with, and so here they are tonight. Dr. Elizabeth Chalecki is Assistant Professor of International Relations in the Department of Political Science at the University of Nebraska. Her expertise lies in the intersection of climate change and international security, global environmental politics, science and technology. She holds a PhD in international relations from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, an MSc in environmental geography at the University of Toronto, and an MA in international affairs from Boston University. She's published over 20 books, articles, chapters on diverse topics such as climate change and Arctic security, environmental terrorism, climate change and international law, public perceptions, and environmental issues, as well as water in outer space. So you see that we'll be going somewhere very interesting with this. Ash Eliza Smith is an artist, designer, and researcher who incorporates strategies of performance, narrative, and speculation to frame problems, reimagine systems, and build worlds across multiple platforms. Ash has worked as a producer, a director, a writer for various media groups and publications, and is an assistant professor of emerging media arts in the recently launched Johnny Carson Center for Emerging Media Arts at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And so thanks for everyone from Lincoln for joining us tonight. Previously at the University of California, San Diego, Ash was the Director of Art and Technology in the Culture, Arts and Technology program and a researcher and artist in residence for the inaugural Birch Fellowship at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. So we're in good company. So my first question is trying to think with all of us tonight here, how Donna Haraway's ideas and the kind of worlding that she shared with us in the film, how does that intersect with kind of the field of international politics and security and so on? So how does these stories that we're making, these new narratives that we're building, can we find allies in the world of this sort of discourse of international politics, and how? So how does this distinctly feminist project, her project, Interspecies Living on a Damaged Planet, intersect with or call on current political theory, specifically environmental politics?
Thank you. Is this all right? Can you guys hear me okay? That is an interesting question. Before I talk about that, I wanted to say thank you to Sylvie and to the Bemis Center for inviting me to do this. This is way outside my comfort zone, so who knows what's going to happen tonight. And also thank you to Angie and Film Streams for putting this film on and letting us come and talk to you all about it, and to you all for showing up. The stories that she's talking about, as I'm watching this film, the stories that she's talking about, I kept inserting my own story into it, and I kept wanting her to give me an example, or darn it, I was going to supply one. But right now in politics, it's a very frustrating moment. We had a question before the film began that we're also missing the State of the Union. So as a good political scientist, right, I should be watching this. But I already know the answer to that question, which is that no, the president is talking about none of this. And neither is anybody in Congress thinking about this sort of thing. I'm 99% certain of that. So I think the problem with storytelling in politics is that the number of stories is limited. Her imagination seems to be going all over the place. She was going from one topic to another topic and bringing it back and so on, and then she'd diverge over here and so on, and then we'd see the dog and all that. In politics, it's a lot more circumscribed. As a self-described policy wonk, you have certain stories that allow you to frame an issue in a way that allows you to address it in a relatively compressed time frame. To be thinking about fantastical worlds and so on is kind of fun, but from a policy perspective, that's a bit of a stumbling block. So drawing on environmental politics, what is going to be necessary for us to continue to live on a damaged planet and hopefully not damage it further is the idea that we need to remember that connection to the non-human beings. Politics right now doesn't allow that story. If you're going to talk about resources, it's only as a matter of commodification. If you have a forest, it's not just a forest, it's some standing feet of timber. If you have an ocean, and we kept seeing those ocean creatures go by, right? But do you know she did this with her hands all the time? Her hands were like jellyfish. If you're talking about the ocean, you're talking about it as either a carbon sink, or you're talking about it as the repository of fish, which you have to fish in your territory before they go someplace else, and some other country under international law gets to fish it. So we have to reimagine that entire relationship, and this is going to be very difficult for a species that thinks that it's exceptional. I'm teaching a class right now at UNO called Radical Environmental Activism, and the students have nicknamed it How to Be an Eco-Terrorist, which I think is, we're not blowing up anything other than ideas, but again, reimagining this relationship between ourselves and non-human species is tricky for college students, and they're interested in it. Imagine how hard that would be for politicians who are not interested in it. So stories like the ones that she's trying to get us to imagine, I think, are going to be useful. Even if we take 1% of the 100% of stories that she imagines, they're going to be useful for us to retell that relationship and maybe define how we live and use resources in a new way.
And I wonder also how her model of community, so the ways in which she's talking about making kins, and in other works she's talking about oddkins, so which is a mix of you know, kind of traditional families with other forms of intimacies and care and love, so friendship, collegiality, also imagination as one of these communities. So I think, you know, for me, much of policy or politics is based in certain conceptions of both the nation on the one hand, but also at the basis of the nation is also the family, right? So how, you know, because nations are inhabited by some living forms and forms of communities that are more sanctioned. So maybe if we're trying to, you know, change the story, we were talking from the sort of a top down. Let's move now from the bottom up. So how do these kind of new sort of models of oddkinning and forming new worlds, you know, how can we develop these stories or these kind of modules and move them up?
I think the stories would actually be easier to tell from the bottom up, so I'm glad you framed it that way. Right now we have politicians telling us that we don't want those people in our country, whoever those people are, insert out group here. We don't want them here because they're not us, they're not like us, they're a different color, they're a different culture, they speak a different language, they have a different religion, and they're not us. And we see the same rise in nationalism happening around the world, from country to country to country, from Brazil to the Philippines to Russia to China to the United States. And I think if we in the community can, what was the verb used, enkin? If we can enkin people that are not our biological kin, that gives us that understanding with which you can change that story at the upper levels. And I think people are willing to do this. Individual people are willing to do this. She said you don't take on every story. You take on just the story right there and just understand it. And that really resonated with me when she said that. And I thought, that's how we're going to solve bigger problems like this. You don't try to look for the unified field theory of everything that's going to solve every single problem. Instead, you want to just enkin the people right here with you right now. And that will change the way you view them and the way you treat them and hopefully the way they treat you. And that's what's going to rebuild the damaged planet for us.
And so moving maybe now from these kind of broader political questions that we will be kind of weaving back in, shifting a conversation a little bit to the kind of artistic part of this film. So it's a documentary. It's not a documentary. It's a portrait. It's not a, you know, I was thinking, like, how would I describe this thing? And for me, it's an energy portrait. You know, and so, and this is a film. It's not just a camera in front of a person. There's somebody reminding us that he is there and that there is a pretty particular relationship as the camera is constantly moving up or down or to the side, and the double appears in the window and the jellyfishes appear. So he's constantly reminding us, okay, we're building this story together. She knows she's holding the green screen ball, right? She knows we're there. So so the filmmaker Fabrizio Terranova takes welcome liberties with the documentary format in his film, whose work powerfully, in this film about Donna Haraway, whose work powerfully combines analysis and imagination. So can we talk a little bit about his strategy, the choices he made on camera and in post-production to convey her far-reaching, irreverent, and playful commitment?
Yes. Can you hear me? Yeah. So, yeah, I think that, I mean, first of all, I think that it's a really, I mean, I think of this film also as an exercise. I think Donna, I've interviewed Donna before about this film, and I think Donna and Fabrizio met at a conference and literally took up the idea of like, let's play together, right? And so you can see in the kind of making of this film that it was very true to this nature of like, let's play through different kinds of languages and formations, both screenal and philosophical and play. And there's all sorts of things that I think Fabrizio is doing here, which is, like you said, it's constantly rupturing the fourth wall, it's constantly breaking it, it's constantly reminding us of artifice, but it's also, I don't know, this is like the third or fourth time I've seen this film, and this time I started counting how much, everyone knows of the kind of talking head philosophy videos. We all know TED Talks back and forth, right? Head, face, talking at you. And so he's really playing with that format, right? And I started counting how much screen time he was allowing for Donna's philosophy, Donna's conversations, human voice, human thought to come at us, and then how much time that was paired with nature sounds, dog images, these quiet moments of in-betweenness, interstitialness. And I actually thought that it was kind of equal. I was really counting. I was like trying to do a 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000. And so I think that notion of like spinning us, as Elizabeth said to the, Beth said to, you go by Elizabeth or Beth, either way, Beth said to the non-human and kind of constantly reinscribing us to this idea that, you know, the last 10 minutes of the film is without visuals and mostly blackness, and not only decentering the human, but decentering ableist human, you know, vision, right? And we all come here to see a visual expression on the screen, but also thinking about the centering of ableist experience of cinema and what that meant. So I was thinking about all of these things this time.
Yeah, and I also thought it was really nice talking about care, how, you know, it's so much part of what what is important to her, and how does this kind of jellyfish break, right, in the middle of the film to give us a moment to kind of catch up and, you know, and be able to kind of follow. And you know, those are really, I think, interesting strategies. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was the architecture of the film and architecture in the film. So there's, you know, so this is shot in one location. We never get to have a kind of totalizing sense of what this place is like. He avoids at all costs the kind of normal spaces that are the spaces of the documentary. So as a woman in a documentary, you'd be going to the kitchen, you would be making tea, you'd be answering the door. So I thought that was really interesting that he's avoiding these things at all costs. So if we can maybe talk a little bit about the use of the architectural spaces in the film, and the thing that struck me this time around it was that there were always open spaces, windows, doors. There's always a way out. It's not a space of enclosure. It's not a space of captivity.
Yeah, it's about frames inside of frames, either through the kind of paintings that we're seeing, but also in the kind of green screen framings and ruptures. But also just architecturally, that is a space that Donna and her kin actually built around them as they lived there. And so thinking about that as a space. I also think something that I talk to students about a lot is the materiality of ideas. And so I really liked how much of it was focused in her room where she would write in. We think of these books that we read and movies we see and video games that we play and all these vibrant story worlds. We often see the kind of material aftermaths of them, but we don't ever think about the place of the process where they were made. And I loved sitting in there, and as Donna says, staying with the trouble, the place where we all feel like giving up and like, I have no ideas or I have nothing to offer this, but just sitting in that space and seeing that through her papers, and we see the books she's wrote behind her, and thinking about how she stayed with the trouble enough to turn many of these ideas into a kind of materiality that we're all sitting here grappling with right now.
So when I first saw this film, it was in Paris with friends of mine there, and what was very interesting is that those friends were frustrated in the film because they felt that he was focusing too much on biographical detail. So it was like, oh, it's too much on, her weird sort of lifestyle and not enough about her ideas. And so I wonder how we feel about that.
Yeah, I agreed. As I was watching it, I thought, what is the idea that we're looking at here? She's talking about her lovers and the dog agility and so on, and I love dogs, so I was okay with that part. But I thought, what is the theory? If this is your introduction to Donna Haraway, what am I supposed to grab onto other than she lives in Northern California and she does this a lot with her hands? I'm not sure what I'm looking at here. But she's kind of gives you warning halfway through the film that she's not taking this that seriously, because she talks about the arrogance of the scholar. Mm-hmm. And that is a story that scholars tell themselves. Trust me, ladies and gentlemen, I know. This is something that you are supposed to do as a scholar, that you are arrogant even just about your little bit of something. Maybe you're willing to cede expertise on other issues, but on your issue, you know it all. And so therefore, there is that bit of arrogance in there. And so she's going to say, well, if you want to find out more about me, look me up, do your research, earn the arrogance, not just let me hand it to you right here in a film.
Yeah, I think she's also just kind of like, it's micro and macro. She's like cutting into the notion of a biography and the fact that we're supposed to be able to sum up our life trajectories and our community trajectories and our family trajectories in like one simple narrative. But it's also, you asked me to speak about the filmic language. She's also using classics like Soviet montage theory, where literally she's taking story parts of her dog, of her lovers, of her Catholic upbringing, and she's stuffing them all together for us in a kind of juxtaposition that makes us assemble our own kind of narrative.
And I think, for me, the most important point of the film is, she's asking us to do one thing, which is to think. And she's saying that thinking is always thinking with others, and it's thinking, the materiality of thinking. And so in a way, for me, this is also what Fabrizio was doing to, she's constantly talking about the various people with whom she's in conversation. And so it's kind of this decentered biography, which, if we're looking for different stories, it's not that of the hero, of the genius, of, it's one that acknowledges all of the people and the things that, make each and every one of us. So, so that was my response to it, and very interesting.
I think it's did anyone notice also the mushroom documentary that screened beforehand? So I was thinking a lot about that, because just in terms of thinking of other kinds of systems and networks that are not, heteronormative, or like that are networks that are operating in these other kinds of systems, I think she's also, exploring that not only through storytelling, but in how she has lived her life. And so I think it is a great case of the personal as political.
I guess I'll have one more question and then we can open to the floor. So many of her texts, and she refers to it a little bit in the film, were written as manifestos. And to me, manifestos are political forms. And so I'm curious about that. And I'm also curious about that and her more recent focus on games. And for those of you who've seen the show at Bemis, or if you haven't seen it yet, think about that sort of relationship between games and the kind of various productivities of game. So thinking about manifestos in games and thinking about the necessity of thinking and about the intersection with kind of political discourse, I'm wondering if there's a space there that's interesting for us to think about, starting from the bottom up and the format of the manifesto.
Well, when people hear the manifesto in our culture, you don't think of a film like this. You would think of the Communist Manifesto. That's the most common. That's the most famous manifesto that we know of, right? And so, the Communist Manifesto, if you read it now, it's pretty dated. You read a lot of the data, and it has to do. He wrote it in 1848, so he's trying to update the information and place it in some kind of context that makes sense to us now, 150 something years later. And I think what's more important about the idea of the manifesto, she said this several times, revolt. You don't have to accept this story that you're being told. You don't have to, she refers to heteronormativity and various other kinds of stories that she's revolting against with new stories. And the manifesto is one of those. Manifesto means I believe. And so you are going to write your own story by revolting against this one that you heard. And I don't agree with this. It doesn't make sense to me anymore. It's outdated. We need new assumptions. We're trashing the planet, so we can't continue to operate in the same way. Revolt. I have questions. I want to live my life in a different way. I was told a story, but I don't buy it. Revolt. And she keeps coming back to this idea of a revolution. She said this several times, and I think that is very important in terms of creating the new story, because just like Schumpeter said with his idea of creative destruction, you don't build anything new except out of the ashes of something old. So for every story that's born, another story is going to die. They can't all exist at the same time. So if you're unhappy with the story, then whether it's a political story or an environmental story or a personal story, you destroy the old one and you create a new one. So from a political point of view, we don't have to be hemmed in by the same political stories we keep hearing, this two-party system. Democrats and Republicans hate one another. It's Americans against the world and so on. We don't have to believe these. We can create new stories for us. So that gives me hope when I'm teaching. And she was right about that, by the way. Teaching is a load. And so when you can't afford to be writing books, and you don't have the mental bandwidth to be writing books and applying for grants and teaching if you've given it everything you've got. So if you're doing that, then you're creating new stories for your students and encouraging them to create new stories for their own lives and eventually their students, whoever they are. So I think that's the most important thing I took away from that, was that hope that you're not locked into a story, politically or otherwise. You can move beyond that and create a new one out of the ashes of the old one.
On that note, your questions now.
So I'm curious what you guys think about the fact that that she chose a man to collaborate with, like considering that the narrative structure that she's trying to deal with and the content of the film itself is about this like sort of patriarchal traditional narrative, and she's trying to, kind of have this upheaval of that through the way that the film is made. So I don't know. I just thought that was interesting that the filmmaker is a dude.
I mean, I think that philosophically, reading, staying with the trouble and this idea of making kin is really, if we boil it down, it's about staying with the heart. And I think so much of what she's trying to convey through the screen and through her work is about creating these kinds of bonds with humans and non-humans that you follow and you keep with you. And I think there's just a kind of, respect in that decision that she made to do that.
Yeah, but also he actually moved in with her for the summer to shoot this film. So I think that there's as much at stake on both, on both sides, the person filmed and the person filming. It wasn't just come in here but he probably had to hang around for many hours waiting for something to happen.
And his last name is Terranova.
I know, New
I
Earth.
mean.
Yeah. And and also, he is part of that kind of expanded circle that she was talking about, the sort of group in Brussels with Isabelle and Vinciane, and so I think he is kind of part of that intellectual community, although he's more of a playwright and writer and activist. So yeah, I think this network of community and is what's in play here for me anyhow. Any other questions?
Hi, yeah. I think the most interesting line in the movie for me was when she was talking about speechlessness and about wonder, and her interest in science fiction and mysticism kind of intersects with that. And I was just wondering what you thought about her articulation of the limits of language and how that intersects with your discipline.
Think about that for a moment.
Well, I'll jump
I
in.
mean, it's a really good question. I'm just immediately go semiotics, 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 semiotics. No, I think that I think there's two things that come up for me that when you say that, I immediately think of her sitting in front of her papers, which she's talking about other philosophers that you have read, but we're seeing the process of literally having the language battle out, or like talking about words and what they mean, and the cat's cradling of her words being translated to French and then back to English and then back to French, and seeing that process. There's a real strength in that for me, and just seeing, again, being in the study, and that words and thoughts and ideas are materiality, but then also, as you said, the limits of that, which is when the scaling of the jellyfish that comes up behind us and makes us, again, kind of decenter ourselves. I also think about, one of the things you're talking about stories just a second ago, I think a big part of this project is about, colonialization and stories, and specifically whose stories get told, and about speechlessness, and about, there's a huge part about being written out of history, and that is a kind of speechlessness as well, of whose ideas and whose stories are told, and power and conquest, etc., which I think is, if anyone's been paying attention to American Dirt in the past 2 weeks, yeah, you have, okay, is a big conversation that's happening around what gets to get told.
Yeah, I'm always, for me, it's always, there's such a long philosophical tradition of saying that, there's a crisis and we have no words to speak about it. So I have, so there's that I'm struggling with. And my attitude and my response has always been just try harder, and maybe that's a jellyfish coming behind it. It can take various forms, but I have a hard time stopping at the fact that something would be that you would have no words for it, or that it would be unspeakable, because there's so many ways of speaking. So I have a bit of a hard time because of that, which is not about what she's saying, but because of our philosophical inheritance. So, but I do understand this. So if she's talking about it as a pause, as something very brief where you go, hell, I don't know how to say this, I understand. But if it's kind of an end, or kind of like, we should not speak after this, then I have a problem. And to me, it's unclear where she stands. But the pause idea, of course, yeah.
It sounded to me, was when you mentioned speechlessness, and then you mentioned the stories, whose stories are being told. When you first asked the question about speechlessness, I thought, that's not usually a problem among politicians. My God, I pray for some speechlessness occasionally. They talk all the time. It's constant noise. Maybe some speechlessness would do them some good. But then you mentioned about whose stories are told and whose are not told. And she mentioned the citation count and about how women's voices are silenced and written out of the stories. There was a paper about 3 or 4 years ago in an international relations journal about citations for literature in the field written by men versus literature written by women. And even though women are increasingly writing more papers in international relations about war and trade and environmental issues of the kind she's talking about, they're not cited as much because the men cite themselves and each other, and the women are not cited. So if there's an article written by women, it's the citation count is a lot lower, and there's a multitude of reasons for this. But that's another kind of speechlessness, a kind of enforced speechlessness, that you have nothing to say because you are a female scholar, or your idea is outside the norm, or the story is new, and we don't have enough evidence for it yet. Therefore, it is kind of an enforced speechlessness. And that's something we all have to look out for.
Yeah, and I would say Angela Davis has been talking about that a lot. Like who is it that we acknowledge? So there is a citation in that whole kind of apparatus, and we know it very well. But, maybe the person who served you coffee this morning was way more important to your thought process that day, or to the emergence of that idea. Or maybe it was your mother, or maybe, so if we are going to have this committed practice, which is I think what she's calling for, we really have to stop and pay attention to how we want to acknowledge, again, our togetherness and how these ideas are formed. Many of these ideas are being formed right now. How are each and every one of us, when we call on them, how are we going to acknowledge that it was born out of this talk tonight? Or, so I think, it's easy to complain or to point at the problem, but then what are we doing and how are we talking about it?
Yeah, and I think the other thing that comes up with your speechlessness question is, I think something that's very instructional for myself in this is about, we can't tell all the stories, or we, even in our own work and practice as artists, as makers, as doers, as livers in this world, we can't do it all. So how do we stay with the thing we're doing? And she relates it to, we can't, the Anthropocene is useful for a giant zoom out. So is the Capitalocene, so is the Tulocene, which she's talking about, and all of these kind of versions that we can zoom out and think of these large abstract things. But these large abstract things sometimes are the very things that shut us down and make us feel disconnected and make us feel like we are speechless because we don't know what to do or how to act. And so it's a matter of kind of zooming in and finding the detail again, just in the way Cayenne is breathing up there. It keeps kind of going back to the fur and the breathing and those moments of the detail, and zooming into a story, not the entire story.
One more question over here.
Thank you for your presentation. It was great. I'm wondering if you see the possibility of another mode of economic critique on the horizon in your disciplines. It seems that Donna Haraway agrees with her colleague Bruno Latour to some degree that the critique has run out of steam, even though she still sees value in reading these texts. Do you see economic critique that isn't built on Marx, Adorno, Stuart Hall, etc.?
I think Sylvie and I, in our first few sentences of meeting, we did that. What's the quote? It's it's easier to imagine the apocalypse other than another kind of economic model. I forget who says this. Do you know who says it? I mean, anyone have thoughts on
the
that?
Apocalypse. Economic critique can take a lot of forms, and I don't know if we're going to overhaul the entire economic system and all the assumptions and norms and laws and conventions and regimes that go with it in time to avoid serious damage to the planet. If we can overhaul part of it, I'd be happy with that. As to what form it's going to take, that takes more prescience than I have. But I think one of the key assumptions that we're going to have to revisit is this idea of expand or die. And that's the central tenet of capitalism, that you have to keep growing and growing and growing. If you can't do it in your country, you move out to other countries. Lenin called that imperialism. And so I think we have to reconsider what this is going to look like. And a lot of the writers that were writing at the same time that Donna Haraway was doing some of her stuff, but Small is Beautiful and the Rome Project and so on, that they are actually trying to bring capitalism from grow or die to steady state. How do you do that? There's a lot of ideas. None of them have worked because no one wants to try this first. The country that tries this first is going to be at a competitive disadvantage to other countries. So nobody wants to go first to try this until nature brings it down on us, and then everyone's going to have to do it all at once. So I think there's still value in the old texts. But again, with the stories, we're not limited to just those. So if we can learn something from those and then move on to what story fits our situation best.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's been really, really important in my work for a long, long time is to find these other stories. So there are many other stories, many other economic stories that have been successful, not only utopian, because everything that's somehow has potential is quickly labeled as unworkable, utopian, and so on. And I think the challenge that we have is to connect the dots. So there have been several models of international or planetary collaboration, some of which are very, very recent in our lifetime, but probably, I would say, most of you don't even know about them. I didn't know about them until recently. So there's such a thing as the non-aligned movement, which was a third way between the two blocks, right? After World War II. They had an elaborate economic program, an elaborate political program, and a kind of pieced together cultural program that still has a huge legacy and impact. The huge legacy and impact is very easy to track on in economic term. The highest rate of home ownership in Europe is where? In the former Yugoslavia. Why? Because there was social housing, and when Yugoslavia fell apart, workers were allowed to buy their homes at a very low price. So you end up having a rate of home ownership, which is one factor of economic that is higher than Germany, France, and all of these so-called more developed countries. And I could talk about all this all night. I mean, another model is, if you just backtrack a little bit further, pirate republics. Again, we think of pirates as pirates of Penzance or something. But there was, and for a long, long time, very healthy, self-determined republics, so healthy and self-determined that the US Navy was born in response to the success of the Pirates of Algiers. The first external war that the US had was with pirates. And it's not just one incident, but the whole notion of a US Navy or a national navy was born out of that. So the challenge is that these stories exist. They, these are real lives of real people, except that they're constantly being erased and they're not being connected and they're deemed utopian or far-fetched. So I think part of our kind of retooling is, looking into these things and thinking through them with other people. So I'm just throwing that.
Yeah, and I would just say that, just also her model of making kin, just even in the small notion of what if we were able to adopt other adults, is also a kind of radical, especially in the, world, the richer countries, I think she proposes. What would that do?
Sylvie, we've got time for about one more question right over here.
So I better make it good is what she's trying to say, right? So early in the movie, I was struck specifically by Haraway talking about science fiction writing, about how the writing itself is doing theory. It's not talking about theory. It's not trying to describe anything to you outside of the story itself does the work. So I guess what I would ask is, do you think that this film does the work? Is the film doing theory, or is it telling you about theory?
Great question. I need to think for a second.
I'm speechless. Wow. Yeah.
I think that's the proposition that they took upon. I think they met at like a jeu speculative, some kind of speculation in France, right? And I think that was the proposition that they took this project up on. I think it is very, I think it was, as a director, I think it was a very interesting choice to end with her own kind of fiction, right? And end in kind of a darkness and very like, also I didn't talk about the sound in this formally, but like let's not, the sound is a completely 100%, created for this film, and it was a major formal component. And so at the end, really the sound is what's driving it and her story. So I thought that to what you say and the science fiction and the power of that, I think that not only formally, I think it was approaching what you're saying, is letting it do the work, but I think that ending on her proposing, what if we had different, desires and ecologies and symbiosis and structures. I think she was offering that in that kind of fiction writing.
So she's creating new worlds in the science fiction, and she's inviting us to do the same. In answer to your question, I'm not quite sure if she wants us to be thinking, and that seems to be what the she's ringing that bell again and again. She wants us to be thinking, then she's forcing us to do that. So I maybe it is theory. Again, that's a little outside my area of expertise. But I'm coming away from this film thinking, how would I reframe this, or what would I do that, or if I were directing this film, would I have asked her another question? Would I have asked the dog a couple questions? I don't know. But it makes me consider things in a different way than I had considered them before. In that case, I guess the film is theory, at least to my limited understanding of it. By the way, it made sense when you said the filmmaker lived there for the summer, because at one point you can see the camera's on the dog, and the dog wakes up and goes, oh, this guy's here again. And the dog just puts her head back down like, oh, man, he's still here. And then when he said he lived there, I thought, that makes sense.
Okay, sorry. There's one thing. I know we're at the end, but and maybe you can just come and talk to us at the last few moments. But one thing that Sylvie proposed, which I am actually interested in, I've done this screening before in Los Angeles and San Diego, and you have done it in Paris, and you had proposed, like, what does it mean here in Nebraska, in Omaha, in 2020? And so I'm curious if anybody has thoughts about that.
Don't be shy, but we can also move to the lobby and have a big party and discuss it.
As in, what does it mean to see it in Nebraska?
Sure. Or if that's what, if you have thoughts on that, or what does it mean? I don't know. Yeah. Is there anything about local, about place, about now, here that you think about?
Well, I think Nebraska really loves that kind of monoculture. So to see a movie that is not particularly about something that's about monoculture, it's about really letting everything flow in, and everything is interrelated. So being here, I'm like, oh, okay, how would Nebraska work if Donna Haraway's kind of principles of kind of shared symbiosis with the whole state happened? I mean, it would change the economy. It would change our relationship from people here in Omaha to people out in Ogallala. It would change our relationship with the river. So I just think everything would really break down in a way, and that's, I think, the beauty of seeing the film. I mean, for me, when I was watching it, it was such a tough watch for about the first at least 45 minutes, because it was not shoving things down me. And once I allowed myself to be that jellyfish, then all of a sudden I was really into it. So in answer to your question, I think it really was that thing. It worked together.
Thank you.
Final thoughts, guys?
Thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.